What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And we are back looking at probably one of our favorite formats currently, because this standard format is deep and it's evolving pretty quickly, all things considered. And where we've kind of seen the Esper mid-range decks go from being neck and neck with the Golgori mid-range decks, we've now seen Golgori and even some of the aggro decks take a step back, Golgori taking a considerable step back, and Dimir definitely pushing itself out front into being just the overwhelmingly, best deck in the format by being kind of the go-to option for a lot of the really strong and powerful players in this standard metagame. But with that said, in the last few weeks, we've had this Esper self-bounce deck kind of show up, and it has a lot of cool things going on with it. There's a lot of neat little synergies here, and playing some very powerful cards to just, grind your opponent into dust. This definitely feels very mid-rangey, as it can kind of grind with a lot of decks. It also has some pretty aggressive slants towards it as well, that of course we're going to be going over in this video today. But before we get into any of that stuff, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we talk mainly about the standard, modern, and pioneer formats, as well as doing some other longer form videos, just ways for me to kind of rant and ramble about one of my favorite games of all time, Magic the Gathering. So if that's something that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when those videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. If you'd like to support me even further, I got a few links in the description down below. One goes to my Discord server. Feel free to follow that link and join over there. There's also a link to the Casual Spikes podcast YouTube channel, where me and my co-host Randy over at MTG with Randy talk about the current RCQ season going on, what you should be playing in those RCQs to try to qualify for the regional championship, and any other Magic the Gathering news going on, and of course still covering things like Modern, because even though it's not the current RCQ season, they've had a lot of really good unbannings, really good bannings as well. The format looks really sweet. The regional championship season is coming up for Modern and stuff too, so just some things to kind of keep in mind when you're kind of going over there, because we like to talk about a lot of that stuff whenever we can and kind of pinpoint things down. Lastly, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. Manatraders is a monthly based subscription service where you can rent essentially whatever cards you want and play whatever format you want on Magic Online, so you're able to play in various different leagues and not having to be tied down to a specific deck. They even have their own tournament series every month where they have a different format that they kind of change it up to, and you're able to play and win actual prizes and even qualify for their own invitational event at the end of the year, which also again gives out prizes and stuff. So you end up getting a lot more prize support if you're actually subscribed through Manatraders to get into their event. So if you use my code in the description down below, you'll end up getting 5% off your monthly subscription. And of course, very handy tool when you're playing, trying to figure out what decks you want to play, essentially, instead of having to actually sell them, potentially just lose money on your decks trying to play as many different decks as possible. So thank you to Manatraders for sponsoring the channel, and let's go ahead and get into this Esper bounce deck. So this Esper deck is pretty interesting because, again, it is a relatively new archetype. It's still definitely being kind of refined and trying to find the right number of things to play and really what cards to play in this deck. This is just one that ended up making the top 4 of a final, or of a standard challenge, very recently here. And a lot of the things that we see across all of the Esper self-bounce decks are the bounce cards themselves: Nurturing Pixie, Fear of Isolation. Fear of Isolation, 2 mana, 2/3 flyer. As an additional cost to cast the spell, you return a permanent you control to its owner's hand. So it doesn't have to necessarily be any of the permanents that we want to pick up, but if you kind of want to get full value from something like Fear of Isolation, you're going to want to pick up some of the enchantments that we're going to be going over here in a minute. Nurturing Pixie is this card from Outlaws that didn't really see any constructed play up until now. So as a 1 white for a 1/1 flyer, when it enters the battlefield, you return up to 1 target non-fairy, non-land permanent card to its owner's hand, and if a permanent was returned this way, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Nurturing Pixie, essentially getting to be like a 1 mana 2/2 flyer in a lot of respects. And a lot of the things that we're going to end up bouncing and kind of abusing these kind of effects for are going to, for lack of a better term, like kind of grind our opponent into the dust. Kind of like the idea that we have going on here. So before we get back into any of these other knuckleheads, the things that we want to be doing, we want to be bouncing some very powerful enchantments in the format. Hopeless Nightmare definitely doesn't come up as like a super powerful enchantment, and when you're only doing it one time, you're playing it, you're getting one card out of your opponent's hand, that's not really something super exciting. But when you're able to replay it 2, 3, 4 times over the course of 3 turns, and you're really not investing too many cards, you're definitely adding to your board, because again, Fear of Isolation and Nurturing Pixie are going to be able to eventually pressure your opponent's life total. Hopeless Nightmare is going to get a card out of your opponent's hand, and they're going to lose life as well. So again, you play this like 2, 3, 4 times, they're going to lose 4, 6, 8 life. You have a bunch of 2/2 flyers in play. Eventually, you're going to be able to close out the game relatively quickly, and your opponent's not going to have the necessary resources, or are going to be down so many resources that even if they do answer the flyers, they're going to have like little to no cards in hand, where you're still going to have more than likely 3, 4, 5, 6 cards in hand to kind of finish up, cleaning up whatever they're playing, or to kind of continue to do a lot of the same thing, and your opponent's just not going to have enough to kind of get back into the game. Storm Chaser's talent is definitely not at its best in this deck specifically, but just getting to make a 1/1 blue-red otter creature token with prowess, and then again getting to kind of pick up and play a lot of these powerful non-creature spells, and just be able to make 2, 3, 4 otter tokens, and then again have a turn where you cast 2, 3, 4 spells. You end up attacking with a board full of 2/2s, 3/3s, 4/4s, whatever the case may be, and it makes it very hard for your opponent to have to do that over and over and over again, where even if they kill the token, they only kill part of the Storm Chaser's talent. Nowhere to Run has been a very popular removal spell that has kind of seen more play in the Dimir decks and some of the black-based decks, for the fact that Shelter by Ghost is a very popular card, so it technically circumvents the Ward 2 on that card, but it's also just a very solid removal spell, giving a creature an opponent controls -3/-3, which is usually good enough to end up killing a lot of the other creatures in the format. You're also, as long as it's on the battlefield, creatures your opponents control can be the target of spells or abilities, though they didn't have hexproof or ward hexproof, and their ward abilities don't trigger. So as long as this is on the battlefield, Nowhere to Run is going to be able to get rid of cards enchanted by Shelter by Ghost, which can be very annoying to deal with, trying to get enough mana to do the thing you want to do. And as you can kind of see from the kind of converted mana cost of this deck, you don't really need a lot of mana. Like really, if you're at like 2, 3, 4 lands, I would say like 3 to 4 lands is definitely the sweet spot. Where you get any more, you're looking towards doing some bigger loops here. A card that I'm not particularly excited about in this list in specific is Bottomless Pool / Locker Room. This card, you bounce something for the 1 mana side, and for the 5 mana side, if a creature, one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you end up getting to draw a card. I kind of like the Cadaver's Lab room, where you can, play it, and whenever cards like leave your graveyard, you can make a 2/2, and the other side lets you rebuy, essentially raise dead a creature, brings it back to your hand, so you're able to, for enough mana, play it, and then you're able to get the creature out of your graveyard, make a 2/2, play that creature, something like a Nurturing Pixie or a Fear of Isolation, bounce the Cadaver's Lab back to your hand, and essentially do the same thing over again, where you're going to be able to make a 2/2 every time through the loop, and then you're kind of free to block with like Nurturing Pixie or Fear of Isolation, for the fact that you're just going to be able to get it right back. You're going to make another 2/2, and you're going to get this thing back on the battlefield. So definitely really neat there, but you can also see here too where, you want to play something like, play this, and then you bounce like your Nurturing Pixie. You end up triggering something like Optimistic Scavenger, which is another payoff for playing all of these enchantments over and over and over again, even though you're playing just 15 of them. Just the fact that between Pixie and Fear of Isolation, which is also an enchantment, by the way, you're just able to kind of buff a lot of these creatures. So Optimistic Scavenger, just saying, whenever an enchantment you control enters, or whenever you fully unlock a room, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So you can pump this, you can pump, the Fear of Isolation if you just want a really big flyer to kind of fly over what your opponent has going on. And with things like Spiteful Hexmage, which can trigger the Optimistic Scavenger, also give you another thing on the battlefield that you can bounce. If the Spiteful Hexmage, unfortunately, has to have the Cursed Roll token attached to it, you have some other ways of just bouncing it, getting it off, and, having it be a 1 mana 3/2. But it does trigger your Optimistic Scavenger and allows you to kind of do these things where you can kind of offset the cost of having a curse roll token. Also just making a very big creature to basically make it a lot harder for your opponent to maintain their board state and remove your creature from the battlefield. A card that's been seeing a lot of play here recently in various different blue decks, Mockingbird. It's something that I really like in the Jeskai Convoke decks nowadays, the Azorius Convoke decks. A lot of the like Dimir mid-range decks seem to be picking it up, and this deck really shouldn't have been any different. This is essentially like more copies of Nurturing Pixies and Fear of Isolations when they are on the battlefield. Even getting something like an Optimistic Scavenger, copied with a Mockingbird. Whatever creature you copy ends up getting flying. A lot of the times in the Convoke deck, I end up copying something like a Shieldred to basically mitigate some of the life loss from my opponent's Shieldred, and also the fact that mine flies too, and you can just chump block with your creatures and just get in with a Shieldred and, again, offset kind of the life point differential from you drawing cards, whatever the case may be. Mockingbird just offers a lot of utility, not only for this deck trying to copy your own creatures, but getting to copy your opponent's creatures as well when you absolutely need it. Another thing that a lot of Dimir decks have kind of picked up, Kaido, Bane of Nightmares. This went from being, a 2 to maybe a 3 of, and you were crazy apparently for playing 3 copies of this in your Dimir deck, to now this is a full-fledged 4 of. You cannot or should not play any less than 4 copies of it, and has definitely found its ways into the other kind of blue-black, mid-rangey type decks where you just want to be able to play a very powerful Planeswalker, and this might just be one of the best Planeswalkers currently in Standard. Playing 2 copies here, we could see this kind of go up, but the emblem, not really too relevant, but just getting to Surveil 2 and then draw a card for each opponent that lost life this turn, kind of whatever, but like a Surveil 2 draw card is pretty nice. A 3/4 with hexproof on your turn is also a card that can get pretty aggressive, and in a pinch you can just tap down a creature and then put 2 stun counters on it and, really lock down your opponent's best creature for quite a few turns until you're able to kind of build back up the Kaido, or even just kind of assemble lethal with kind of the mishmash of things that we have going on here. Lastly, we have this card, This Town Ain't Big Enough. This is a 5-mana card, but costs 3 less if you target a permanent you control, and you return up to 2 non-land permanents to their owner's hands. So a lot of the times with this, you'll see it more often than not target 2 of your own things. So you can end up bouncing something like a Hopeless Nightmare and a Nurturing Pixie, and you're able to just play the Nightmare, get your opponent to discard a card, play the Pixie, pick up the Nightmare, put a counter on the Pixie, play the Nightmare again, get another trigger out of it. So you're able to, essentially in something a turn like that for like 4 or 5 mana, just make your opponent discard 2 cards. You end up putting another 2/2 in play. You might be able to get in for 2 damage and have like Pseudo Vigilance on the Nurturing Pixie, pick up Mockingbird to then replay it as a different permanent on the battlefield, maybe again one of your opponents, maybe going back to like a Nurturing Pixie, so then you can do this loop of like Hopeless Nightmare, things like that. And then if you want to include any other enchantments in said loop, or like Nowhere to Run if you want to get creatures off the battlefield, Storm Chaser's Talent if you just want to make some 1/1s and kind of start to go wide. This is definitely the bread and butter, and what makes this deck very powerful is the fact that a lot of these very cheap enchantments, while again, you do it one time, it's totally fine, and even then is still kind of a pretty decent card. Storm Chaser's Talent especially, just a very good card. But with this deck in particular, the fact that you're able to play Storm Chaser's Talent and play specifically the same one 3, 4, 5 times, and I don't think it's really crazy to think that that's something that could actually happen. You end up just generating a ton of value. You end up getting to a point where you can level this up to level 2, return This Town Ain't Big Enough to your hand, bounce a Storm Chaser's Talent, one of your other opponent's creatures, and then replay Storm Chaser's Talent, and again have access to that same This Town Ain't Big Enough to eventually get to a point where, I'm going to hard cast it, I'm going to bounce 2 of your things, and then I'm going to get in for a ton of damage and more than likely win the game. The sideboard does look really good. I think Authority of the Consoles, when Jeskai Convoke is definitely seeing an uptick in play, is very good because it definitely limits the damage that they can do with a Imidane's Recruiter, and just being able to play out a bunch of things. It definitely delays them a turn or 2 off of their knights and delays them just that long for them to set up those turns where they want to slam an Immodane's Recruiter and attack for a bunch of damage. Tiny Bones joins up. We've actually seen Jerry Thompson playing a blue-black version of this deck, and it was playing main deck. Tiny Bone joins up. Essentially, when it enters a number of target players, each discard a card. I don't think the legend part of it really mattered too much, but just being another enchantment that forces your opponent to discard a card when it enters play, totally fine. Destroy Evil is becoming a staple of the sideboard here. Destroy creature with toughness 4 or greater, or destroy target enchantment. You end up doing this a lot of the time against the Dimir decks. No More Lies just as some interaction, nowhere to run at the 4th copy if you really want the removal. Rest in Peace, almost in this kind of version of the deck, is probably fine because, again, you're not necessarily using your graveyard all that much. Where like the Cadaver's Lab, you absolutely more than likely cannot play this Rest in Peace unless you're planning on just also bouncing it as well and just like redeploying it when it really matters. But this is like a way that you could, in theory, beat the mirror from, that they're playing Cadaver's Lab. If you just play Rest in Peace, they can't loop their thing, make zombies while also just, again, getting to reset it and whatnot. Another Shelter by Ghost, 4 copies. This card is just still great, even if more people are playing Nowhere to Run. Just playing Shelter by Ghost is really good against the aggro decks. You just slap this on one of your creatures, especially after you make it huge with an Optimistic Scavenger, and your opponent has a very hard time racing you in those scenarios. Shrouded Shepherd. This is a way that you can give creatures your opponents control -1/-1 till end of turn. Ends up killing a lot of the X1 tokens and creatures that have come from the Convoke deck, which again can be very powerful. This also just being something like it enters the battlefield, you can give target creature you control +2/+2 until end of turn, get in for a ton of damage, and then of course just pick this back up and have access to the adventure side of it again. And 2 Tishana's Tidebinders. This card has just been, I've been very impressed with it the little bit that I have played with the Dimir deck, and I can only imagine here that it's at least like halfway decent in this deck. So that is the Esper Self-Bounce deck for Standard. This deck has been on fire over the last few weeks since it has existed, and currently is crushing it in the Atlanta Spotlight Series. I would not be surprised if this deck just kind of continues its dominance well after that event, and we just kind of see it be one of those decks to beat as we kind of march towards the the end of Foundation's Standard and look towards Aether Drift coming out in February. So that's something to be on the lookout for, and this is definitely a deck that you need to have a game plan for. If you're going to be playing the deck, obviously great. I think it's an awesome choice right now. And if you're going to be playing against it, you definitely need to have a plan and to kind of understand what they're working towards and how you can delay them as best you can while also enacting your game plan, which, you can say for a lot of the decks in the format, but this one in particular is just so annoying to deal with from how often they just continue to like rebuy their annoying permanents and then just replay them and just get more and more and more value over time. This is definitely a deck that it feels pretty easy to just like pick up and play. It seems like it's pretty obvious, but I think it's a deck that does have a decently high skill ceiling, and you are going to want to put in tons and tons and tons of practices of trying to figure out like how many times with this town ain't big enough you're just supposed to bounce 2 of your permanents instead of maybe yours and an opponent's, where that seems like you get some of the best value out of it. But that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video. Comment down below what you think of the Esper Self-Bounce deck. Of course, consider subscribing to the channel. Subscribe to the Casual Spikes podcast if you want even more content from myself and even from my co-host, Randy, over at MTG with Randy. Follow the Discord server, join the Discord server. Follow me on Twitch. Check out the code for Manatraders if you're interested in signing up for that kind of service. Again, you get 5% off of your monthly subscription. And yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.